When I was in the Ministry of Defence as one of the heads of capability, one of the driving threats was China and the other one was Russia. And we thought this is how big the bear was, how capable it was, and we had to prepare for that. Now that the Russian bear has been exposed as a rather less giant, rather less capable, and having lost over 2,000 main battle tanks, having had a very bloody nose in Ukraine, is Russia the same threat to Europe that it was 2 years ago? No, it's not. In 5 years, 10 years, when it's rebuilt, absolutely, Russia might be emboldened. But as we sit here today, Russia has played its hand and exposed to the world just how relatively inept it is. It has volume, it's been able to lose a lot of people, but it's not the threat to the West.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from TimesRadio. My name is Alex Dibble. I'm TimesRadio's Deputy Head of News. Today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a former fighter pilot whose 32-year career in the RAF included commanding one fighter squadron and the Harrier Force, tours of Bosnia, Sarajevo, the Gulf, Afghanistan, and heading a strategic combat air review. He's now a prominent military and security analyst and the host of the podcast Red Matrix. Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, welcome.
Alex, good morning.
I thought we would start by talking about the developments in Ukraine over the last 24 hours or so. We can move on to more broader discussions about the conflict in a little bit. But in the last few hours, we've had drone strikes by Ukraine on Russia, seemingly quite successful electricity supplies being cut, all oil refineries on fire in Russia. What's your assessment on how successful Ukraine have been in the last 12, 24 hours, but also with more recent drone strikes?
Yeah, Alex, it's a great question because the danger is things like drone attacks attract media attention. They look as if Ukraine's having a decisive impact. If you remember, President Zelensky made clear he wanted to get his industry to develop 1 million drones a year. So that's clearly a big focus for the Ukrainians. And they've used these drones remarkably effectively, whether on the front line or whether doing deep strikes against Russia. And they're quite difficult to defend against, particularly some of their longer range drones, because Russia's only got limited amount of air defences, and therefore if you put them in one place, then Ukraine will attack another. The trouble is there's an element of pragmatism about this, though, that the only metric of success in this conflict is territory gained. That's the important metric, and that's the one which Russia is grinding forward on the battlefields as we speak. It is still grinding forward, taking a little bit more land, with Ukraine on the back foot because it's trying to preserve manpower given its shortage of weapons. Now, that doesn't underplay the huge impact that the Ukrainian strikes are having on Russian infrastructure, but it's almost certainly more of an irritant to Russia rather than actually having a decisive military capability.
And is that the same, do you think, with these incursions into Russian territory from people, Russian forces loyal to Kyiv and their cause, who have actually gone? We heard last year quite a lot about this, but even the last day or two, we've had more incursions from the Freedom of Russia Legion, for example, into Russian territory from Ukraine. Does that for you fall into a similar category, something that will generate headlines, but actually in the grand scheme of things, not too significant?
Yeah, I mean, exactly as you say, Alex, that we've been commenting on this ever since the start of the campaign. I think what's fascinating is from a Western perspective, we come from an island nation. So if you're British, you know where your borders end and where the European continent starts. If you were a Russian, or you're a Ukrainian, there is a border, but it's largely just a bit of land where one side of one arbitrary line is Ukraine and the other side is Russia. And of course, inevitably, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was a county of the former Soviet Union. Therefore, county lines in this country, you don't think of them as national lines, do you? You drive across them. I was across in Wales at the weekend. I've crossed several county lines to get there. Whereas now Ukraine is a sovereign country. So there's quite a few people who live in Ukraine who consider themselves Russian, and there are a lot of Russians who consider themselves Ukrainian. As a result, we've seen several of these sort of bands of enthusiastic, I would say amateurs, because they're not a professional military organization, making incursions, often seizing a village which isn't particularly defended, and then the Russians come out in force and obliterate that capability. So whilst again it attracts newspapers, I think one of the reasons we get seduced by this a little bit at the moment is if we look at Alexander Navalny's untimely death, and with the President Putin's elections due, there is a concern that would there be some sort of national revolt against President Putin? How would the Navalny effect, the very fact that Russia's lost 300,000 soldiers, 100,000 deaths, 200,000 badly injured, would this eventually wash into the psyche of the Russian? And what will we see as indicators of that? I don't think this is an indicator of that at all. I think this is purely an effort, realizing that Ukraine's a little bit on the back foot at the moment, to try to dominate the headlines, demonstrate intent, but I don't think it's going to swim the course of the war at all.
One thing or developments that could potentially be slightly more significant is what's going on in the Black Sea at the moment. We've had more Ukrainian successes in the last few days. Again, and that indeed has allowed Ukraine to start their exports in ways, once again, that is crucial to the economy and things like that. Do you see what's happening in the Black Sea as evidence of Ukrainian success in that area, particularly when we see that the Russian Navy head has been sacked?
It is fascinating. I think it's fascinating from a military perspective because Ukraine had a navy, but it scuttled its only ships that couldn't escape. So it doesn't have a navy in the Black Sea. Yet somehow a country that's smaller than Russia without a navy has managed to dominate the Black Sea, has inflicted, I think it's 25% of the Black Sea fleet is now on the bottom of the ocean or will never set sail again. Phenomenal success. I think there's two things, though, that you should take from that. One of which is Ukraine has been very effective at getting their drones, their maritime drones. Now, we tend to think of drones as little things. The drones they're using at sea are 1,000 kilograms. They are pretty 400-mile range.
They look like mini planes, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
They're pretty impressive, and the water-based ones look like a coffin but on steroids. But they are incredibly effective when massed against a Russian ship. And I think it serves to a couple of purposes, one of which it shows that, honestly, any military organization with ships should have a pretty effective defense against drones. The most recent ship that the Russians lost was only launched in 2021. That should have state-of-the-art defensive capabilities, and yet it was not able to withstand these attacks. That speaks volumes to, it's one thing having a ship, it's quite another having a real capability. But I think the key for Ukraine, where it does help Ukraine, rather than being an irritant, is it's pushed the Russian Black Sea fleet further east. And that's meant that it's provided freedom of navigation for Ukraine on the western side of the Black Sea. That's allowed it to have export its grain, which of course generates vital revenue for the country that can actually help sustain its war effort. So that does make a difference. And I suspect that's why Russia has sacked the erstwhile head of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. And it's worth remembering as well, it doesn't mean that Ukraine has destroyed the Russian Navy. I'm sure many of the viewers will be aware that the military shipping that's in the Black Sea can't leave the Black Sea. The Bosphorus Straits are controlled by Turkey. They won't allow any military traffic either way through. So what you've got in the Black Sea, you've got to live with. And of course, now Russia's lost a good proportion of that, including modern shipping, and that will cause a bit of fear. And also the other thing it's worth pointing out, if you remember, probably a year and a half back, there was talk that the Russians might do an amphibious assault against Odessa, the port across to the west. To do that, they'd need to dominate the Black Sea. It's almost certain that by whittling away at Russia's naval capability, the prospects of doing any form of attack against Odessa like that are almost slim to none now.
Another thing that the developments in the Black Sea have allowed is the head of the Ukrainian intelligence agency, Lieutenant General Budanov, saying that attacks in the Black Sea were preparatory measures for a serious operation in Crimea. What do you think he could be getting at there? What could he mean by that?
Interesting that, Crimea is it's very topical because it's a jewel in the crown for President Putin. We don't have time for a full history lesson, but Russia managed, the former Soviet Union managed to seize Crimea, which gave it access to a warm water port, the port of Sevastopol, when 99% of the world's trade really goes via sea. Russia never had a warm water port. Hundreds of years ago, Peter the Great, it managed to seize Sevastopol. It was never going to give that up. And part of the history of Crimea was that it was given to Ukraine, I think it was 1954, by the then President Khrushchev. It wasn't given to Ukraine. It was a county of the Soviet Union, and administratively, electricity and water came from Ukraine. Therefore, let Crimea be run. When the collapse of the Cold War happened, Russia and Ukraine very nearly went to war about Crimea, because Russia went, no, it's not yours. It's never been yours. And Ukraine went, well, it is. They came to some sort of agreement. My point being is that Russia is never going to give up Crimea without an immense fight. Crimea has withstood many world wars, and has got the same defences that are in place there. By Ukraine threatening that there's going to be an operation against Crimea will cause the Russian leadership, will cause the Russian military to divert more military focus on Crimea as a bit of a deception plan, potentially, for activity elsewhere. Is Ukraine going to be able to take back Crimea? Most West analysts think that would be incredibly difficult to do, and it's almost certainly something that Russia would fight to the end to preserve.
The final thing I wanted to talk to you about before we have a sort of more wider, broader conversation about the conflict at the moment is the A-50s, the Russian A-50s. There is an understanding that Ukraine has damaged severely another, and that it could even be that 4 of the 8 Russian A-50s, these long-range radar planes, are now damaged to the extent that they can't fly. How significant is that when you consider these planes have been very important for Russia in terms of their capability and what they give?
I think it's fascinating for a number of reasons. Again, is it going to change the course of the war? Probably not. But from a Western perspective, when I did my time in the military in the Cold War, it'd be fair to say we were nervous about the capability that the then Soviet Union and then latterly Russia had in terms of some pretty impressive military hardware. The problem is what this conflict has demonstrated. It's one thing having an A-50, which is a really, really credible bit of kit, or some of their military fast jets. But that doesn't make a capability. A bit of equipment doesn't make capability unless it's in the hands of somebody who's well trained, unless you invest in its defensive aids, unless you invest in the tactics, unless you have good simulators to make sure everybody runs through the scenarios, unless you've got the defensive layers around it. Russia clearly has never invested in some of that stuff. And therefore, that's why it appears that over 25% of Russia's fast jet fleet has been targeted and destroyed, when Ukraine barely has an air force to fly. And the A-50, which is a strategic asset, should always be operated somewhere very safely, far away from harm's way. And yet, Ukrainians appear to be quite effective at shooting it down. One of the ironies here is that I don't know, but the likelihood is that the American missiles, the Patriot missile system, was used to target it. That missile system's been around since the 70s. Now, I look around this room, some of you guys probably weren't even born then. And the technology was pretty poor then. Now, obviously, Patriot's been updated a lot, but one of the reports of one of the A-50s being lost is actually the Russians trying to fire a missile to take out the Patriot that ended up shooting at the A-50 itself. Now, I don't know what the truth is of that, but the fact is that without proper training, the Russian Air Force has been singularly impotent in this conflict. They should have had a leading role, not only the A-50, but particularly the fast jets, providing air support to their soldiers on the ground. And yet they've had a pummeling at the hands of the Ukrainians. And you have to ask yourself the question, Russia has invested a lot of money in its Air Force, and yet it's proved to be relatively incompetent when it comes to actual war fighting. That has emboldened many of my former Air Force colleagues who thought, why were we so worried about the Russian capability? We saw the jets whizzing around an air show and thinking they were fantastic. When it comes to the crunch, they proved particularly inept. And I think that the example of the A-50 is just a further example of that.
So you think it could even be making a few people think maybe we could have done things differently a few years ago as a result of what we're seeing now?
I don't know. I think there are a lot of lessons certainly to be judged from that. I mean, one of the things that, one of the frustrations I get asked occasionally is, surely you ex-military, you want war. Trust me, when you've seen the horrors of war, I spent 2 years of my life in Afghanistan. You see the horrors firsthand of our young, brave, largely men, but men and women with arms and legs missing or whatever. It's horrible. Nobody who would ever want to fight in a war. Part of your role in the military is to be a good deterrent. In other words, be so good at your role, be so credible and capable that any potential adversary thinks twice before they have a go.
So Russia did that well, is what you're
Correct.
saying.
They did that very well. And actually, what's really good is that now the rest of the world has seen how incompetent Russia is. The interesting spin-off of this is that Russia used to export a lot of its military capability based on that illusion that they were very capable. There's a lot of countries in the world now who are now looking to the West for providing military equipment, because actually it doesn't look like Russia's were quite as credible as the advertising material might have led you to believe.
Let's talk in a bit more general terms about the conflict. So President Zelensky has said that the situation on the ground is, on the front line, as good as it's been for months. Is that bluster?
We are living in an information war at the moment, and we've got to be very careful what we believe and what we don't believe from the leaders. If you look at this from a grand strategic perspective, Russia is by far the biggest nation. Ukraine is a minnow. Russia has state-of-the-art equipment. Ukraine does not. Russia should have swept through, and it's only through Ukrainian bravery, the fantastic resilience of their people. But that only takes you so far. And it was the support of the West, particularly with weapons, not just dumb artillery shells and stuff like that, but precision weapons that enabled Ukraine to strike with precision Russian positions across the battlefield. That's what made the difference. The challenge is at the moment is that the West provided loads of weapons to Ukraine ready for its spring offensive last year, started a bit late. 6 months after that, the front lines hadn't really moved at all. And the West has sort of gone, well, if you couldn't make a difference with us emptying our war chests, what's the West going to do now? Because we gave Ukraine a lot of weapons that were slightly, not out of date, but near their sell-by date. We've literally emptied our coffers of those. You can't nip down to the supermarket and buy some more. So how do we make up the gap? Now, some commentators will turn around and say, collectively, NATO and the West has got an order of magnitude bigger defense industrial base potential than Russia does. Yes, it does. But you've got to have the intent to mobilize that. Russia has done that. It's also bringing in weapons from North Korea, 1 million rounds of ammunition, and from Iran, missiles they like, and it's got its own defense industrial base fueled by oil revenues. What does Ukraine have in return? Every time it develops a factory, months to factory, Russia fires a missile, schwack, takes it out. Ukraine can't use its Western weapons to go and strike Russian territory. So Ukraine is utterly dependent on the supply of weapons from the West, and that has dried up. So at the moment, Russia's on the front foot. President Zelensky is desperately saying, no, it's fine, everything's good. But he's putting a brave face on what is a very uncomfortable position for Ukraine at the moment.
And that ties into comments from Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary, president of Hungary, who has said after a meeting with Donald Trump that were Donald Trump to be re-elected as US president, he wouldn't spend a penny on the Ukraine-Russia war. I mean, we suspected and we knew that Donald Trump was not in favor of bankrolling the Ukraine war effort, but this seems to be evidence of quite how staunch he is in that view.
I think there's two things here, one of which I think we have to be very careful of what President Trump says, because sometimes...
What are you suggesting?
Sometimes a lot of what comes out just doesn't make sense at all. There are two things here, one of which is the NATO angle. Trump has been very disparaging about NATO. If you actually strip away the rhetoric, though, we're now up to 32 countries in NATO. There was an agreement 10 years ago that all countries would pay 2% of their GDP to defence. 10 years later, only 11 of the 32 countries actually do that. And therefore, it's not unrealistic that America, that provides 3.5% of GDP and is by far the biggest provider, is looking over its shoulder and going, hang on a minute, why are we providing defence to all these countries that refuse to actually pay for their own defence? Particularly when Russia's invading on the European mainland, and France doesn't pay its 2%, Germany doesn't pay its 2%. So I think there's some interesting narrative around that for Trump. What Trump is going to do after the election with regard to Ukraine, I think I forget about Viktor Orban for a moment, because Hungary's got quite close ties to Russia anyway. So we've got to bear in mind that. Would Trump continue funding Ukraine? At the moment, President Trump loves to do a deal. And bluntly, there is an argument, I'm not saying I subscribe to it, but there is an argument that says Ukraine was given all the weapons and support and money, didn't turn the dial at all. If the West continues to plough money and weapons in, is the West simply prolonging a war that actually needs to be stopped? And Trump would love to do a deal, and therefore it feels like what he's probably arguing is that this is not a battle Ukraine can win. In other words, that Ukraine can rid its whole territory of Russians. And therefore, how do you draw it to an end? Now, it's an incredibly emotive subject, because ultimately it's up for Ukraine, it's up to President Zelensky to decide what he wants to do. But without the supply of Western weapons, and although 60 billion is locked up in Congress, and people would argue you've had 60 billion euros from the EU, yeah, it's money, but it wasn't weapons. It's America that's still got big chunks of weapons available, and without those, life is going to get very, very difficult. So it's difficult to predict, in answer to your question, what's going to happen. I think we've got to be very careful to look beyond the rhetoric from former President Trump, but there's definitely winds of change blowing across the Ukraine.
And that plays into what, pardon me, what a lot of people were saying when the war began, which was President Putin would just seek to outlast the West.
I think one of the things that I think all of us would find very frustrating is that if President Putin was to win. Now, I don't quite know what winning and losing looks like in this conflict, because if you were to take it to its literal sense, for Ukraine, winning would getting rid of Russia out of all of its former territory and the Crimea. That looks unlikely to happen. Would Russia's win be completely taking over and subjugating the whole of Ukraine? Again, looks really unlikely that's going to happen. And given the massive casualties, the massive refugee crisis, the devastation that's been caused, it's very difficult to see there's any winners here. But if appears likely that Russia's special military operation, Putin has consistently said it is only that, if he's focused on the Donbass, he's focusing on making sure he doesn't lose Crimea and having the land bridge in between so that he can resupply Crimea, it is possible that actually it would meet his near-term aims. And therefore, that might be the point at which he'd be prepared to say, right, stop. Because don't forget, Russia is suffering a lot for this war. There's lots of different metrics, but it is suffering a lot for this war. So it might well be that he'd say, right, I've had enough. Now, President Zelensky would almost certainly not be happy with that. But there are lots of other players that will have a role to play. And I think that's what's going to happen. If we don't solve the weapons crisis for Ukraine by May, which is when spring largely there's been the thaw and the ground has firmed up again. If the weapons haven't been sorted out by then, it's going to be a very difficult summer for Ukraine. And the danger every day that goes by is Russia actually become emboldened and push even further.
So let's end by looking a little bit at the war as a whole from a sort of where we are now in comparison to where we were a year ago. We're not looking at the individual peaks and troughs of the graph. We're looking at the general trajectory or otherwise. Where do you see the situation now in comparison to 12 months ago? We're 2 years into the conflict now. Where are we now in comparison to where we were 1 year into the conflict?
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit on that and go, let's go. So pretty swiftly after the invasion, Russia took a load of territory. And I think it was back in October of 18 months ago, President Zelensky's team managed to push and liberate 12,000 square kilometers of Kharkiv. And that was the basis for him saying to the West, give me the weapons, I can finish the job. They gave him the weapons, he was not able to finish the job. We've now find ourselves in a bit of an impasse, but with Russia still edging forward on the battlefield. It's the middle of winter. There's no foliage. That you can't dig foxholes. Russia is taking huge casualties, but they are making progress. And it does appear, therefore, that they are utterly focused on securing the Donbass. I think for me, from a grand strategic perspective, I think it's a difficult time for Ukraine. I would also explain, though, it's a more bizarrely, is slightly more reassuring for the West. The number of times I get asked, are we on the verge of World War III because of all of the, conversation around this? When I was in the Ministry of Defence as one of the heads of capability, one of the driving threats was China and the other one was Russia. And we thought this is how big the bear was, how capable it was, and we had to prepare for that. Now that the Russian bear has been exposed as a rather less giant, rather less capable, and having lost over 2,000 main battle tanks, having had a very bloody nose in Ukraine, is Russia the same threat to Europe that it was 2 years ago? No, it's not. In 5 years, 10 years, when it's rebuilt, absolutely, Russia might be emboldened. But as we sit here today, Russia has played its hand and exposed to the world just how relatively inept it is. It has volume, it's been able to lose a lot of people, but it's not the threat to the West. So I think in terms of Ukraine, really difficult. In terms of the West, bizarrely, it's somewhat reassuring.
And so if Russia and China were the two main threats that people in the Ministry of Defence worried about when you were working there, is that still the case today, or is it China and Iran, or China and another, or Iran and another? What are the two? Or is Russia still one of them?
One of the difficult things when you've left the Ministry of Defence is that you don't have access to all the intelligence and the like, and it would be completely inappropriate of me to sort of speculate as to where the threats lie. But you look at some of the countries in the world, like Iran, who are causing some of the mischiefness in the Red Sea. They're funding the Houthis, they're funding Hezbollah, they're funding Hamas. They are still having an influence around the world, but are they a grand strategic threat to the world at the moment? That's for others to judge. But where you look at China's aims and objectives, and particularly Russia's expansionist aims and objectives, they were probably still the enduring focus of attention. And I think we're seeing from America, I'm being, again, big hand, small map. Europe deal with Russia. America, we're going to deal with China, or at least keep our eye on China. So, it's very difficult to tell from a beleaguered Ministry of Defence here exactly what their priorities are. But I suspect it's still those two are the main ones.
We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
You're welcome,
it's been
Alex.
Fascinating.
You're
Cheers.
welcome.
Thank you for taking the time to watch today's episode of Frontline from Times Radio, our podcast dedicated to defence and security. For more, do listen to the Times World in 10 podcast, where we look at not just defence and security, but all global matters, the important ones that you need to know. That is the Times World in 10 podcast. For now, though, thank you again for your time, and we'll see you soon on Frontline. Do remember to subscribe for more from Frontline and from Times Radio.